And we're back with our panel. Peggy Noonan is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor of The Atlantic. David Ignatius is a columnist for the Washington Post. And Ben Domenech is the publisher of The Federalist. Peggy, I want to start with you. The FBI director has been fired. What does this mean at the end of this week?
It means a hugely unnecessary mess involving chaos and drama and a certain amount of brutality, I think, happened that didn't have to happen. I think Ben Sass was right. These things do. Firings like this, when they are badly done, do sort of harm institutions and harm public confidence and trust. I think the president, first of all, we all know he has every right to hire or fire those he wants who work for him. But the way in which he did it swamped the substance of his reason, from the original brutality towards Comey and the way he had to find out, through the strange tweets about, boy, he better hope I didn't tape our conversations. This is all the chaos, like the bag of chaos that Donald Trump carries with him every day and everywhere, that is self-destructive for him and self-sabotaging, I think.
David, a lot of different stories this week on exactly what happened.
Well, we're still sifting through. The initial White House account of the firing was shattered by the president himself. The argument that the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein had taken it upon himself to make the case against Comey, and that was then backed by the Attorney General. And then Trump comes on television and says, no, that's not how it happened. I wanted him gone. Talking this week to several prominent Republicans, people who have not been sharp critics of Donald Trump, I heard the same thing, which is, this guy scares me. And I think the reason that people were scared this week is that they saw impulsive behavior, they saw a kind of vengeful brooding about past slights, they saw a willingness to be just basically to lie to the country, not to tell the truth. And I think one person said to me, there are no guardrails on this presidency. Another person said, this is Richard Nixon on steroids. In other words, this is a kind of hyperactive. So I think that's where we are at the end of the week. A lot of people are scared, and they wonder, how do we get out of this?
I'm genuinely surprised that was their reaction, given that the president has shown himself to be so reserved and organized all the way up to this point.
But this is a different order.
It is a different order, but I think in this case what we see is, you know, the president, frankly, from my perspective, had a situation where he wanted to fire Comey from day one, but I don't think that he felt politically solidified enough in the early going in order to do so. And as the weeks and months went on and he saw Comey's repeated appearances, he did the same thing that I think a lot of people do when they see someone who's irritating them on television, which is get irritated at them and then want to do something about it. In this case, he did. When it came to Mike Pence's comment about doing the right thing at the right time, frankly, was day one. If the president believed that James Comey was not qualified for this position, he should have gotten rid of him day one. He didn't for political reasons, and that's led us to this point of disorganization and chaos.
About a minute, Jeffrey.
I want to focus on the self-inflicted nature of these crises. Remember, in the short presidency of Donald Trump, nothing terrible has happened yet externally. So what I mean by that, and God forbid any of these things should happen, but we've had no Fergusons, we've had no San Bernardinos, Orlandos, Paris attacks, a North Korean missile hasn't fallen onto South Korea, Israel-Hezbollah war. We haven't seen any of these things. And so what we're dealing with now is a White House, look, even the best, most organized presidency, the best White House, sometimes succumb to crises, right? But we have a White House that creates chaos, to borrow from Peggy, chaos for itself. It can create chaos on its own schedule, and it still messes it up. And so we have a serious problem here.
All right, we're going to talk about this some more later, but we'll have in a minute more of our conversation with former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. And we're back with more from our political panel. Peggy Noonan is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and her best-selling book, The Time of Our Lives, is out in paperback. Peggy was also recently awarded the Pulitzer Prize for last year's campaign commentary, and we congratulate her for that.
Thank you.
Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor of The Atlantic. David Ignatius is a columnist for The Washington Post, and Ben Domenech is the publisher of The Federalist. David, I want to start with you. Coming out of what Secretary Gates said, he feels reassured by the foreign policy team that the president has around him. What do you make of that?
Bob Gates, as we just heard, is the steady voice of continuity. He's been around since the Reagan presidency, and he has that depth and clarity. And he's right. Trump chose a national security team that's first rate. A lot of them are people that Gates recommended. Rex Tillerson was a Gates proposal. It's the State Department. James Mattis, a general widely admired. Secretary Kelly at Homeland Security was actually Bob Gates' military advisor way back when H.R. McMaster similarly came up in that sort of broad school that Gates helped preside over. I thought I heard Secretary Gates say that on domestic policy he is troubled. As he looks at the Comey firing, he finds elements that worry him. And so the obvious point is that President Trump and the Senate need to respond to this week that we've had by choosing someone to run the FBI who is in that category of strong, steady, reliable national security leaders that we just talked about, that Bob Gates, in a sense, represents. If they can make a nomination like that, they've got some former judges who are terrific. Mike Rogers, who was recommended by former FBI agents, ran a bipartisan committee and made it work. But if they can choose somebody that the country will trust, who's on that list, then I think they begin to get out of this.
Peggy, Secretary Gates said the president needs to limit spontaneity overseas.
Yes.
What are your expectations for this big foreign policy trip the president has?
That was a deft way, I think, for Mr. Gates to say, please don't freak us out while you're overseas. I take a very simple, unlettered view of this big foreign policy trip from the president. I think he's saying essentially, I am Trump and I am real. I am a real president. I am doing what real presidents do. I'm meeting with popes. I'm meeting with sheikhs. I sort of think, in a way, most foreign policy trips involve a certain symbolic acting out of who you are. So I think the trip essentially is meant to say, I'm here and I'm normal. I hope, as Gates says, he doesn't get too colorful or anything like that. I know there are serious foreign policy components to the discussions. I'm going to leave it to you guys. But to me, this is symbolic, and I hope it is peaceful. It would be very nice if we got a little no trouble that is unneeded. Calm. Grown up. I know, but
chances are slim that he's going to say something in front of the Pope that causes an ignition. It's after.
Is that
on
a dare?
Twitter.
Plus, the Pope will forgive him. He's in that business.
Right. No, I don't. I don't think it's going to be. The trips are very scripted. It's after the trip. It's when you have a crisis. I hate to keep going back to this point about crises, but these trips are scripted to avoid crises. He's not going to try to instigate a new Israeli-Palestinian peace process, I think, at this moment. But what I worry about is when it's the, what it is? It's the 3 a.m. phone call. We haven't had the 3 a.m. phone call yet, and it's not clear to me that even that iron triangle of Tillerson, McMaster, Mattis can stop an impulsive reaction on the part of the president that might not be easily pulled back.
The issue here, too, just to get back to Comey for a moment, is that the president has a way of taking something that ought to be done and making it more chaotic than it deserves to be. It's my opinion that James Comey deserved to be fired, that it was clear that he deserved to be fired, that his incompetence in the investigation of Hillary Clinton alone deserved that, even without the various points that he made afterwards. And he had lost and burned through a lot of bipartisan goodwill on both sides of the aisle. But that's not why the president made the decision that he did. John Podesta, the morning that James Comey was fired, tweeted out in reference to his testimony the previous day that the American public is getting mildly nauseous listening to James Comey. That's fine, that may be true, but that isn't the reason that the president ought to have made the decision that he made. And that led to all of the chaos this week for something that ought to have been much more organized, much more laid out, and as Bob Gates said, something that's planned where everybody says, this is why we did the thing we did.
Peggy, let me ask you about that chaos, because idiosyncratic president with some disruption going on. Secretary Gates suggested that in some places that disruption was doing some good things, getting NATO to pay up, getting the North Koreans to realize America was serious. But in this case, the president said he made his decision for reason X. And then the vice president went out and said, yes, it was because of the Hillary Clinton email server.
Yes.
So the vice president is now on the hook for an explanation that the president then undermined. So isn't that a cost of chaos to his vice president?
Oh, sure. Trump always puts his people on the hook. Do you know what I mean? He doesn't just harm himself. He harms his whole operation when he acts in this antic manner. But let me tell you quickly something I'm thinking of as we all speak here about this whole Comey drama. What obsesses us in Washington, as we well know, is not necessarily what obsesses America. What we talk about on this panel is not our views, not necessarily reflected out there. I was so struck yesterday with everybody I know in conversations. It was all about Comey, the FBI, who's the next guy. Then I put on the TV and I see the president wowing them at Liberty University. They got their MAGA hats on. I am struck by the distance between our conversation and the national conversation, and I'm struck by the distance between Democrats and Republicans as they approve or disapprove of the Comey thing. It's an 80-20. Democrats are 80%, I hate the Comey firing. Republicans are 80%, I love the Comey firing. This
on the other hand, he's not the most
big.
popular president we've
Understood.
seen at this
Understood.
point. Liberty University might be a little bit outside the norm.
He's got his base, is what I mean.
The base
he's
is
not growing
but 40%
his base.
of the country thinks he's right. I heard from a Republican this week the best argument against having a special prosecutor, which Adam Schiff and others have called for, which is you need to keep regular order. You need to say to the 40% who voted for him, we're not creating a special committee prosecutor to get your guy. We're not out to get you and what you voted for, and keep it regular. Ask the politicians who were elected to run it, to run the investigations. Ask them to reject a bad FBI nominee. If he sends up a crony, a bad person, the Republicans have to vote against him. I mean, that's when we'll know that we're getting better here. If the Republicans reject a bad nominee.
Ben, what's your sense of where Republicans are in response to this? Because, of course, what Peggy says is right, and the president knows how to use and that disconnect between. But there are some things still in this day and age in which people in Washington are supposed to be concerned about a few things, even if the country isn't. I mean, in some ways, that's kind of what they're here for.
What I hear mostly from the Republicans that I talk to is they're concerned that this level of chaos will prevent them from furthering an agenda that they need to run on in a year and a half that they believe is very important. I think they would be very disappointed if anyone who was not a qualified individual was put forward for the FBI director position. I think, though, the real concern they have is we need to pass a health care law. We need to pass a tax reform law in order for us to be able to go back to our constituents and get reelected in a year and a half. And that's something they worry will be negatively affected by all this.
Let me make one quick point about stability and truth-telling and chaos theory. At some point in the future, Donald Trump is going to have to organize an international coalition of some sort in order to combat a serious problem. Let's assume it's North Korea for right now. Bob Gates worked for President George H.W. Bush, who organized one of the greatest coalitions in history with James Baker against Saddam Hussein in 1991. They did that because they had credibility, because people understood them to be steady and stable and telling them the truth. And this president is, our current president, is spending down that capital, what little capital he had on that, very, very quickly. And so we're heading into a possibility of a situation in which he has no credibility on the international stage when he's going to need it.
Peggy, let me ask you just back on the domestic for a moment, though. As Ben says, there are a lot of things that aren't getting discussed.
Yes,
and now this sense of unpredictability. If I'm a Republican, how do I handle the fact that you've got a president who is going to be doing some exciting things that you might have to answer for?
Exciting things, what a nice way to put it. What David said. A big decision will be made now about the FBI. If a serious, sober, low-drama, integritous person is put forward, everybody will be relieved, actually, and they'll go for it. If some sleazeball is put forward, forgive my language, or some toady or whatever, Republicans will stand up and say, this won't do. I really think that will happen, but I also think it's what ought to happen.
All right, I'm going to have to stop you there. We got to talk about Mom. Sorry, Peggy.